Welcome back for another session of financial instruments. In the previous session, we discussed LKS number 32 in relation to the definition of financial assets, financial liabilities, and equity instruments. And we resume from there now. How to classify liability and equity instruments. That is basically the distinction, whether an instrument is a liability or an equity. First of all, I must tell you, liability always goes with the concept of entity having an obligation to settle. If an entity has an obligation to settle, then it is a liability. And on the other hand, if the entity has no obligations to settle, settlements either to service or to settle, then it is an equity instrument. For example, now if you take ordinary shares, which are not to be purchased back by the company, there is an equity instrument. And the dividend what they pay is not under compulsion. And company has no obligations to pay dividend at a predetermined rate. Then it is pure equity. Whereas if you take debenture, you got to pay interest and you have obligations to settle on a day. So that it's a debt. So this is how you have to classify, or these are the things that you have to take into account in classifying liability and equity. And sometimes you may see an instrument may have several features, about say 10 features. Of the 10 features, most of the features are moving with equity, and some of the features are portraying a debt instrument. Then how do you classify that instrument? Are you going to go by the features that the more number of features principle? No. Say what I'm talking about is example, say you have 10 features. 10 features. Of them, say 9 equity, 9 portrays equity, and 1 goes with the debt. And you can say, okay, out of 10, most of the features are with equity, therefore this is an equity instrument. No, it is not the principle on which you decide. Always, even if you have 1 feature of debt, it is a debt. No matter how many features you have which supports it to be an equity, but even if you find 1 particular feature which is to support that it to be a debt instrument, then you must classify that as a debt. Taking that into account, let's go through these examples. There are 4 examples were put down there. Number 1, preference shares, provided the holder with the right to receive an annual dividend, usually of a predetermined and unchanging amount, out of the profits of the company, then it is a debt, financial liability. You can put it as, in short form, FL, financial liability. Because you are supposed to pay a dividend annually at a predetermined rate. Number 2, redeemable preference shares in which the holders are entitled to a fixed level of dividend. and to be repaid a fixed amount on redemption. That again a liability because company has obligations to redeem and pay dividend. Third one, A PLC issues 100,000 preference shares. The preference shares are redeemable only at the option of A PLC. If the shares were to be redeemed at the option of the company, then it is not an obligation. It is an option the company has. If the company wants, they can redeem. Otherwise, they can stay without redeeming. Then there is no obligation on the part of the company to redeem. Up to this point, it is equity. Then they say a preference share dividend is payable at the same amount per share as any ordinary share declared during the year. Now, once again, ordinary dividend is a discretionary dividend. I used this word in the previous episode. Discretionary dividend, where you have the desire to decide. You have the wish to decide. So it is not under obligation. If company wants, they can pay. They can stay without paying any ordinary dividend. If you are not paying any ordinary dividend, then you don't have to pay preference dividend also. So the preference dividend is nothing different compared to ordinary dividend. Therefore, it is equity. Number 4. A has issued perpetual preference shares. Perpetual means unredeemable, which is, if at all, redeemable at the option of the undertaking. Company can redeem. So up to this point, it is an equity, but not at the option of the holders. Okay, that's fine. Dividends of 10% must be paid annually, provided that there are sufficient distributable profits. Now, there you should not get confused. Dividend of 10% must be paid, provided that there are profits. One can say then that is not compulsory. No, it is not. It is compulsory. If you have profit, you have no way out. You have no discretion. You have to pay. That means it's a debt. Now we will attempt this question number 1 given in the same page. During 2018 and 19, entity A has issued a number of financial instruments. Evaluate how each of these instruments should be presented under LKS number 32. A, perpetual bond, that is irredeemable, that pays 5% interest. That means financial liability. You have to pay interest. That means you have an obligation on it. Financial liability. Second one, a mandatorily redeemable share with a fixed redemption amount. That is again a liability because you have obligations to redeem. A share is redeemable at the option of the holder for a fixed amount of cash. That's again a financial liability because option is given to the holder. Shareholder, if the shareholder wants it to be redeemed, then the company has no alternative but to redeem. Therefore, there is an obligation on the part of the company to redeem the shares when the holder wants it. So it is a financial liability once again. Part D, A sold or A wrote a call option that allows the holder to purchase fixed number of ordinary shares from entity for a fixed amount of cash. So this is finally going to entertain an equity transaction. Therefore, the option that has been sold by the company in relation to this transaction should be treated as an equity transaction. Then the last one, E, that is already discussed, I suppose. A has issued perpetual preference shares which is redeemable at the option of the undertaking, but not at the option of the holder, but 10% dividend must be paid if the profits are there. I have discussed that it is being repeated. Right, let's come to the next point to be discussed is compound financial instruments. This is sometimes called hybrid instruments. Hybrid, compound, financial instrument. Sometimes you call it hybrid. You know, hybrid is mix of two things. Hybrid vehicles, run by fuel as well as battery charge. It's called hybrid. So when you talk about hybrid instrument or compound financial instrument, it has it has features of both equity and debt. More than saying features of, otherwise then you may say that, you know, just before I told you out of the characteristics, no matter how many characteristics are there for the equity, but even if you find one characteristic, that should be treated as a debt instrument. I am not going away from that explanation. This is something different. You have a debt, but the debt has certain equity component. The debt instrument has an equity component. As you break the values, you have to find out what is the value relating to the debt component and what is the value relating to the equity component. That is why we call it a hybrid instrument. The good example is convertible instruments. Convertible debentures. For example, convertible debentures. The special feature that you can find there is, it is a debenture, so that's a debt, but it has some equity flavor. Because now you know, you are aware well about convertible debentures. They are convertible into shares. As of now, they are debentures, but they have the potential to become shares in future. So, as per LKS number 33 on EPS standard, they refer such instruments as potential ordinary shares. They have the potential to become ordinary shares. So convertible debenture, the special characteristic is, even though they are debentures at this moment, but the holder, usually the holders are given option to convert it to ordinary shares if they wish to. So when the holders are given an option like that, it is always an advantageous situation for the holder. It's a special privilege. It is an option given to the holders. Because say for example, you invite people to invest in your debenture. The comfort that you are giving to them by inviting them to invest in debentures is, if things were to go wrong, those investors have the prior claim because they have invested in debentures. They can take their money out and then jump out of the sinking ship. That is the comfort that they have, because debenture is always better instrument than ordinary shares. If company were to fall into trouble, then they can quickly, they have the prior claim. But at the same time, if the company were to do very well, say, the company turn around from its situation, and then they have started doing extremely well, and they pay very good dividend to their ordinary shareholders. Now the debenture holders may be wanting to jump into the other boat or other ship, which is the ordinary share ship. Because now ordinary share return is very lucrative. So debenture holders may be wanting to earn a return of ordinary shares rather than getting interest on debentures. So that is the advantage that they have when they were to hold convertible instruments. They can convert from debentures to ordinary shares if they are very much sure that the ordinary share can give them better return. But after coming to ordinary shares, they can't go back to debentures when things were to go bad again. It's only one-way traffic. You can come to debentures, from debentures you can jump into ordinary shares, but going back to debenture is not possible. That's how normally instruments are written. Ordinary shares can never be converted to debentures. So, since they have got this special privilege of being in debentures and also having an option to become an ordinary share when things are better for the ordinary shares, company will be able to issue such kind of debentures at a reduced interest rate. Even the investors would not mind. Let's say, for example, market interest rate is 18%, but debentures are issued at 10%. Why? Because there is another carrot to offer, which is the option to become ordinary shareholders when things are much better for it. So when debenture instruments are issued at a rate of 10%, whereas the market interest rate for a normal debenture happened to be 18%, this particular debenture, this convertible debenture is not compared with a normal debenture. Normal debenture is a pure debt. It's a pure debt. But convertible debenture is not a pure debt. It's a debt instrument, but it has an equity flavor. Therefore, you have to find out the equity component separately from the debt component. All what you have to do is, the cash flows pertaining to the convertible debentures, on the basis that they are going to be redeemed, you have to trace all the cash flows and discount them at market interest rate and find out what the value that you can assign for the debt instrument, and the remaining value from the issued amount is to be identified as equity. Now we will look at that situation through this example given under section 4. An entity has issued 100,000 12% convertible bonds at a par value of 100 rupees. They have issued, right? So how much they have raised? $100,000 multiplied by 100 rupees. Figures in thousands. 10 million. Out of this, we have to find out how much is debt and how much is equity. The bonds are currently priced at 125. That has no relevance to us, because this distinction need not to be changed time to time based on the value of the debentures, the market price of the debentures. Then equity value will keep on going up and down depending on the increase of market value or decrease of market value. That exercise is not supposed to be done. The market rate of interest for similar debt without the conversion option is 18%. And each bond is convertible into 4 shares in 2 years' time. That has no relevance to us here. The bonds are redeemable in 5 years' time at par. Now you take the debt component like this. Years 1 to 5, you will pay how much? Cash flow 12% on 10,000, which is 1,200. This is the interest that you pay. Fifth year you are going to redeem that 10,000. This need to be discounted at 18%. That is the market rate of interest. So take discounted cash flow at 18%. $2,914. $4,371. The total comes to $7,285. So out of 10,000, 7,285 is debt. The balance 2,715 should be identified as equity. Sorry, there is a small mistake here. This one is comes to 3,570, 3,753. $8,124. Then if it becomes 8,124, then the equity component comes to 1,876. Let's come to section number 5 in page number 7. Interest, dividends or similar distribution, losses and gains. Now this all 6 points what I have put down there is important to understand. First point is a dividend to holders of outstanding shares. When you pay dividends to ordinary shareholders, which is classified as equity, must be recorded in the within equity, which means dividend payment to ordinary shares should be dealt in the equity statement. That is what we do. Similarly, if you are paying dividend to any debt instruments, dividend to shares which are classified as debt, for example, dividend paid to preference shares. Dividend paid to preference shares must be treated as any other finance cost attributable to any debt instrument, like interest payment on debenture, interest paid on loan. All that will come to the P&L as finance charge. Here again, the dividend paid to preference shares should also be appearing in the P&L as finance charge. Similarly, gains and losses associated with the redemption of financial liabilities should be dealt in the P&L. And redemption and refinancing of equity instruments should be dealt within equity or changes in equity. And more importantly, number 5, changes in the fair value of equity instruments of the entity are not recognized in the financial statements. This is very, something very, very much funny when you happen to think about it. Now, when you invest in a company, ordinary shares, and when that company's ordinary share value goes up, your investment value goes up. Your investment value goes up. And as an investor, what do? You mark it to the market. You mark to the market and you put the investment at fair value. This is something that everybody now knows. So I invest 10 million rupees. The market value of it 10 million rupees now. Come next year, the market value of those shares have gone up to 12 million. Then I increase my investment from 10 million to 12 million. That's a fair value adjustment. And if that investment is treated as a financial asset at fair value through P&L, then the increase of that 2 million rupees I will recognize in the P&L. That is a well-known treatment. We will be learning it under SLFRS 9. When your investee company's equity value goes up, share value goes up, you do the corresponding accounting in your books against that investment that you have there. That is one side of it. What about your own equity value going up? Issued shares. Now in your balance sheet always you put the stated capital at the money that you originally raised. But you never bother to put that stated capital at the market value. You just give a thought to it. Have you ever bothered to increase your stated capital based on the market price of your number of shares? Say you are a listed company. John Keells is not reflecting in its balance sheet under stated capital the market value of their shares. If they are able to do that, then their debt equity ratio can improve. Sometimes the stated capital can be very low figure. But as it comes to market value, that is what it really portrays. The real value of the company is reflected based on the market value. That is why we are talking about fair value adjustment in all assets and liabilities. But why not on your own equity instrument? So if you are increasing your stated capital based on the market value of it, then there is a credit entry and where the debit should come into. Is a bit of a confusion. But the standard, LKS 32 says, categorically it says, any increase or decrease in the market value of your own equity instrument is not to be adjusted. So we are going by that rule. Otherwise one can come and say that I want to adjust my stated capital based on the market price of it, so that I will have more of my equity capital compared to debt, so my debt to equity ratio can improve vastly. But that is not allowed by the standard. Then I will come to the last point along with section number 7, but before that I want to cover section number 6. This is about treasury shares. Now, the concept of treasury shares, if you ask, is not that popular in a country like ours, Sri Lanka, because most of these concepts are really introduced to Sri Lanka very much in later periods, so that our Companies Act sometimes doesn't get tallied with it. Of course, now we have 2007 Act, but we were harping on 1982 Companies Act for a 25-year period when the whole world was going on different direction. We were hanging on to 1982 Companies Act, which didn't have much of a freedom for companies to do various things. But after 2007 Companies Act was introduced, there's much more linearity, much more flexibility could be seen, and repurchase of shares and all that have come into play. So the treasury shares also is like something like that. The concept is, even though it is not so novel to the world, but for us it is, yes. It is dealing with your own shares. Dealing with your own shares. Now take for example, why we need, now the treasury shares means you keep your own shares. You keep your own shares in your treasury. Let's say, let's imagine, I mean, this is something very, not really how it happens, but what I'm saying is, okay, you have the finance controller has in his drawer, he has the company own shares. Or in a cupboard, they have their shares. That is called treasury shares. In the treasury, they have kept their own shares with them. So how they can buy now? Assume that this is a listed company. They go and buy their own shares from the market. Now John Keells, they are able to buy AK Spence shares. Now one can ask why John Keells can't buy John Keells shares. If John Keells share price goes down, the company people know better than anybody else that how much these shares worth. And they may know, or they may think that it is worth buying at these low prices. So they go and then they go to the market and pay the price and buy their own shares and keep it in the treasury. When the share price goes up, they can sell those shares back to the market. So they can do trading if they want to. But of course with restrictions, because company can't buy their own shares to beyond a limit, and because they are coming under a lot of restrictions, mind you. But I'm just talking about the principle behind these treasury shares. And when you have your own shares in the treasury, what you can do with them? You can do many, many things. You can do many, many things. What? Say for example, you are holding a competition amongst the employees and you are picking the top 10 employees of the company in a year. And you want to reward them. You are not going to give anything in cash, but you announce them that the best 10 employees, the top 10 employees of the company will be rewarded with 100,000 shares each of our own company. So 100,000 to 10. 1 million shares. From where they are going to pick? They are not going to the market to buy and then give. Or they are not going to give cash to tell them, okay, you go and buy it from the market. No. They will take it from their drawers, their cupboards, from the treasury shares and award. Or they can say that the best customer will be given so many shares. So these shares can be utilized as a rewarding instrument. But of course, now say if the customers are given, it's a marketing expense. If employees were to be given, it's an employment expenses. But these shares are going from the treasury. And as I said, for the very reason, I can buy, then I can sell, I can rebuy, I can resell, I can use this for something. So for all this purpose, without meddling it with stated capital, because I don't want stated capital to get damaged and disturbed quite often for a small matters like this. For that purpose, I can create an equity element within the equity definition called treasury shares. And don't ask any more questions. It is treasury shares. You just name it treasury shares. Now come to examples like this. I pay something and then buy my own shares. What is the double entry? Credit cash, debit treasury shares. I sell some of those shares and get cash. Debit cash, credit treasury shares. I issue some shares to my employees to reward them. Debit expenses, credit treasury shares. Then for that other example that I discussed in the previous video, you provide a service and for which you agree to receive fixed number of shares. Then I said it's an equity transaction. If I receive variable number of shares, it's a financial asset. If I receive fixed number of shares, then where it will get landed up? It will get landed up in treasury shares. That's why I just marked it there in the previous video saying equity within bracket treasury shares, if you can remember. So that's how the treasury share account should be maintained. Look at the example given there once again. On 15 January 2011, entity issues 100 shares for 50 rupees. So they receive cash, debit cash and credit treasury shares. Equity means it is needless to say is treasury shares. Then you are purchasing back 20 of them at 100 rupees. Then 2000 you debit equity and credit cash. Then you are reissuing 15 shares at 200, debit cash and credit equity. Now mind you, in all these cases, you are not there to identify the profit or loss element on each point of transactions. Now they are saying you bought at one price, you issued at one price, then you bought it back at another price, then you reissued the same shares in another price. You are not there to find out the profit element included in each and every moment of buying and selling shares. All profits and losses will just be accommodated within equity. Within treasury shares, you are not there to find out any profit or loss. Then come to the next point, which is going along with the last point in page number 7. Cost of issuing or reacquiring equity instruments. Cost of issuing shares or cost of repurchasing shares should be dealt within equity and they are not to be charged into the P&L. Case number 32 says that. There are such costs, they say such costs include regulatory fees, legal fees, advisory fees and other transaction costs that are directly attributable to the equity transaction. Now look at this example, or rather question number 2. And just before that question number 2, the paragraph, if you read, cost of issuing or reacquiring equity instruments, this is other than in a business combination, are accounted for as a deduction from equity. Net of any related income tax benefit. So if the share issue expenses are permitted to be deducted from your in the computation of taxable profit, then there's a tax impact. There's a tax impact on these expenses. So let's look at a situation along with that. I'm not here to talk about whether such expenses can be really deducted or not. That is something to do with taxation. But if you assume, the standard says, because in some jurisdictions the tax laws can be different. These standards are written in a common way, but just that we have not written it to suit our tax law currently prevailing, and need not to be also because we don't have to go by the tax law. The tax law keeps changing. It keeps changing every year, so you can't change the accounting standard also as and when the tax law changes. So they simply write something common, but you have to apply along with the relevant and applicable tax law currently prevailing. Let's look at question number 2. An entity issues 100,000 new ordinary shares, which has a fair value of 23 rupees per share. Professional fees in respect of the share issue are 600,000. The costs are deductible in arriving at the income tax liability. The corporate tax rate is 30%. So you put it like this. Actually, if I were to show it in double entry format, it's better. You can easily understand in that case. You are issuing equity, therefore it's an equity transaction. Cash, 100,000 shares at 23 rupees comes to 2.3 million. So you have cash, debit 2.3 million. Equity. Now expense, $600. Of that, 30% is deductible for tax. Therefore, you deduct tax payable. $180. And balance 420, you charge equity. Expense. So that's why they say the equity, the share issue expenses, net of tax benefit should be deducted from equity. Then the last point that LKS 32, under which I'm planning to discuss, is offsetting, section number 8. Now, the question is about whether a financial asset, one financial asset can be set off against one financial liability. Take simple example. You have a debtor, he has to pay you 5 million, but to the same person you have to pay 3 million. So one can say easily why you have to show 5 million receivable and 3 million payable in two places. You set them off and then put the net amount, which is 2 million that you will receive from him. But that thinking is not correct, because offsetting is not permitted. Offsetting is permitted only if it is legally enforceable. If the parties have the legal right to do that, yes. Otherwise what happens is, now if you try to do that, one can accuse you, because this may not happen simultaneously. I have to receive 5 million rupees in 1 month, and I have to pay to him 3 million rupees in 3 months. So I might insist, you better pay me 5 million in 1 month time, whatever that I have to pay you, which is going to come in 3 months time, which I will pay at that time. So setting off and getting 2 million in 1 month time is not acceptable to me. Therefore, it has to get legally permitted, and also there must be an intention to settle, or the transaction must get settled simultaneously. Then there's no issue, because on the same day you send me 5 million rupees check, then I'll send you 3 million rupees check. That doesn't make any sense, because settlements are taking place simultaneously. If it is going to take place simultaneously, then there's no point in keeping them as two different items. You can probably offset. But other than on these two circumstances, usually the standard doesn't permit setting off or offsetting payables and receivables, or for that matter, any financial asset against financial liability. That's the end of L case number 32. We have discussed all essential points. From there, we can now move on to SLFRS 9 financial instruments for the next half an hour to 40 minutes. SLFRS 9. The title is Financial Instruments. Nothing further. So financial instrument SLFRS 9 standard has replaced substantial part of the contents in LCase number 39. So LCase number 39 has become somewhat obsolete, or rather has been scrapped down, and now it is left only with one particular chapter being discussed, which is hedge accounting. So hedge accounting is not discussed in SLFRS 9. It is being left in LCase 39. So after we finish SLFRS 9, we will have another round of discussion for hedge accounting, and especially for impairment adjustment. I want to talk something more than what is contained in this standard, in this booklet rather. Now this standard now talks about recognition, measurement, and impairment adjustment, all things relating to financial assets and financial liabilities. Nothing about equity instruments. When you say financial assets and financial liabilities, we cannot forget another special creature here. Special creature is derivative. So derivatives are discussed here. I will talk to you about derivatives in the next round of discussion, more in detail. Of course, in the previous episode, we looked at what a derivative is and how it can work, and how it can be accounted to a limited extent. But we will be having a full discussion on derivatives as a speculative instrument and derivative as a hedging instrument. As a hedging instrument, things are largely covered in LCase 39. Now, having said that, we will come to talk about recognition. So I just give you the layout. When you say recognition, as you come to recognition, you need to talk about financial assets, and for financial liabilities. And then we talk about measurements. Measurement. Initial measurement and subsequent measurement. Relating to financial assets and financial liabilities. Of course, the impairment also comes as a special adjustment under that. Impairment. Impairment is related only for financial assets. Liabilities cannot be impaired. Only the assets can be impaired. And recognition, if you are talking about recognition, you cannot forget about talking on the opposite of it. What is the opposite? The opposite of this is derecognition. Once again, derecognition of financial assets and derecognition of financial liabilities. And needless to say, you have to talk about derivatives in all cases. And SLFRS 9 more or less stops there. Then you come to LKS 39 and talk about this special area called, again, accounting for derivatives, but when the derivative to work as a hedging instrument. So, which is called hedge accounting, which we will discuss under LKS 39. So, this is the scope of our discussion for SLFRS 9. Now, we will take one by one. Recognition, this is where, when do you take a financial asset or a financial liability into the balance sheet? Because these have to go to the balance sheet. So it has to come to the balance sheet as either financial asset or a financial liability. Now this is about when do you recognize, when do you bring them in? An entity should recognize financial asset or liability in the balance sheet when and only when it becomes a party to the contractual provisions. When you become a party to the contract, you have to then, that is the point at which you have to bring financial asset or financial liability into the balance sheet. That is why very reason we say that derivatives also have to be brought in. They also can be financial asset or financial liabilities. Derivatives. And they also need to be measured. Now you are signing a forward contract to buy US dollars, right? At 200 rupees. Now the dollar is going at 210 rupees. You have already a value on the forward contract worth 10 rupees a dollar. So that is an asset. It's a derivative asset. So more precisely, if you want to know, I can say a derivative forward contract. I can drop the word derivative. It's a derivative, we know that, but we can say forward contract. Now the forward contract is an asset for us. And if you ask what kind of an asset that is it a physical asset? No, it is a financial asset. So a derivative is a financial asset. If it happens the other way around, derivative can become even a financial liability now for the same reason. We have agreed to pay 200. Now the dollar is at 185. You got to pay 50 rupees more because this is not a agreement or this is not a contract that is retractive. You can't retract the contract. Forward contract is non-retractable. You have to abide by the terms and conditions of the agreement. So that so if you have agreed for 200 rupees price for a dollar to be paid in 3 months' time, and if it's currently going at 185, there's a 15 rupee gap. That has to be identified as a liability at this point in time. But as you progress, we don't know how the exchange rate will move this way or that way. But we have to understand that at this point, this contract is more unfavorable for us. So it will create a financial liability. That's how the derivatives have got into place for accounting in entities. There was a time people didn't think that derivatives should be accounted for. Because, okay, we have entered into a contract, or we are not paying anything now, we are not receiving anything now, let us deal with it at that time, and we'll, until financial instrument standards, got into place, derivatives were not accounted. So then what happens? Actually, large value of assets and liabilities will go unrecorded. Now it is not possible. If you are signing a contract, from the time you become a party to the contract, the implications of that contract will get reflected in the balance sheet in rupees and cents terms, in debit and credit, or in the form of asset or liability. So, very good example is derivative. A forward contract, financial options, those are derivatives. And examples I have given. First one, forward contract. That's what I discussed just now. Financial options, where the holder has the right to buy or holder has the right to sell. Any underlying. It can be shares. The example that we looked at earlier was a call option written on shares. So that became a derivative. That was a derivative which was required to be accounted for. The third item that I have given there, planned future transactions. Planned future transactions. So that's something funny there. See, I said that when you become a party to a contract, a financial asset or financial liability can get created on your part, on your side. So financial asset or liability cannot be recognized until you become a party to a contract, until you come to a contract signing point. And now in the third item what they are talking about is a planned future transaction. The planned future transactions are not a result from a contract being signed. It's not coming out of a contract you are signing. So it will not result in any financial asset or financial liability, even a derivative. We are simply saying planned. The plan can change. the plan, you can retract from the plan that you discussed. You can come back and then give a call to the counterparty and say that, sorry, I am not feeling comfortable in signing this contract. You can discuss and come, you can plan and come, but planned transactions are not committed transactions. Therefore, they will not result in any financial asset or financial liability. Then come to talk about financial assets in particular, because we need to talk about initial measurement and subsequent measurement relating to financial assets. Now, since we are talking about financial assets, initial measurement. We first of all understand financial assets are categorized into three types. I just put it as this: amortized cost, at amortized cost. Number two, financial assets at fair value through other comprehensive income. And third category, financial asset at fair value through P&L. We'll discuss about this each category a little more in detail, and how to identify, say, a particular financial asset as to which category that it will belong to. That part of discussion we will have in a little while, where I need to discuss about the business model and the cash flow characteristics. I'll come to it later. But the initial measurement says financial assets should be measured at its fair value. Initially, it is at fair value. And having said that, they talk about another important item, which is a transaction cost pertaining to the financial asset. Now, say, for example, you are investing in a share. You are investing in shares of a company. And for that investment transaction, there can be transaction cost. That is called transaction cost, brokerage and valuation fees, and you pay like all sorts of expenditure pertaining to investments. So, how do you deal with this transaction cost? The standard makes it very simple and very straightforward. They say that transaction cost will be added if it is belonging to this category, first category, financial assets at amortized cost. So, apart from the fair value of the investment, the transaction cost initial, what we are incurring, should also be added to it. And also, for the second one, transaction cost should be added. which is financial asset at fair value through OCI, other comprehensive income. For if the financial asset were to fall into one of these two categories, they have to be added to the financial asset. But if it is coming to the third one, then the transaction cost must be written off to the P&L. Now look at this illustration, number 1, given in page number 12. An entity purchases financial asset for 1,000 rupees, which is classified as financial asset at fair value through OCI, other comprehensive income. So transaction cost of 20 will be added to that. So the carrying value of the financial asset will become 1,000 plus 20, 1,020. If the asset had been classified as fair value through P&L, it would be measured at 1,000 and the 20 rupee transaction cost will be written off to the profit or loss. It's very clear. Now we will come to another point that I touched slightly in the last episode. Or if you go to this right up under 3.1, initial measurement, they say, on initial recognition, financial assets, all financial assets, but within bracket, except trade receivables, are measured at fair value. So then what about the trade receivables? The trade receivables are not to be measured at fair value. Then they have to go by the principles given in SLFRS number 15, because the receivables are coming out of revenue transactions. Revenue transactions are guided by SLFRS number 15. Now if you come to the last point in the page number 12, they say trade receivables which do not have a major financing element are measured at their transaction price in accordance with SLFRS 15. Take the transaction price and move on. You are not bothered to find out what the fair value of it is. For example, you sell goods and as a result of that trade receivables comes in, you are not going to find out how much market value of goods that you have sold. You just record it at the transaction price, and we believe that transaction price must be the fair price. But even if it is not the case, you can't do anything about it. You have agreed to receive a sum, and the customer has agreed to pay a sum, and nothing more than that you can record. The amount of consideration expected in exchange for the transfer of promised goods or service to a customer. Right. Now we just learnt about they all be put on fair value, but transaction cost should be added to the financial asset if it comes under first two category, amortized cost and the fair value through OCI. But if it is a category belonging to financial asset at fair value through P&L, the transaction cost must be written off to the profit or loss. Having discussed about it, then we come to subsequent measurement. Subsequent measurement. Now look at this. Now it is the time for us to learn about these three categories. Financial asset at amortized cost. This is amortized cost. This is fair value through OCI. This is fair value through P&L. They are coming into three, they have to fall into one of the three categories. Let us learn more about it. Now, as you decide, when you decide whether it should go to amortized cost or fair value through P&L or fair value through OCI, in deciding that, you must look at two considerations. the two considerations. One, business model. Two, cash flow characteristics. Characteristics. Business model and cash flow characteristics. Now, when it comes to business model, you need to look at something like what? What is the intention that the entity has, company has, towards this particular financial asset? What is the intention means? What is the kind of business model that they have thought about? A business model means why people make investments. You decide. You tell me about that. Why companies make investments? Because they have got one thing. They have got surplus cash. So they may be wanting to park this money temporarily somewhere, and they want to take this money out whenever they need money. This is maybe part of working capital. So, suddenly some excess cash comes in, and CEO may ask the company accountant to park this money somewhere for a short while. Then look at the model, the thinking, the motive of making this investment. This is not to be there for a long haul. And the company is not planning to keep this money in a bond until it matures. So the accountant may select something like some investment in shares temporarily. So you invest today, and in 2 weeks' time, 1 month time, you just sell it and then take the money out with a profit or not. So then that is one kind of a motive can be there behind this financial asset. The business model is that. On another occasion, you may be targeting, you just go and invest in a bond, and you may be planning to be with that bond until it matures. Say, 10-year bond. For 10-year bond, the accountant may have been asked to go and park some money in that 10-year bond. And if he asks, okay, are we interested in selling this next year or another 5 months, 3 months? No, don't do anything. Just put that money there. We'll wait there till it matures. Then your plan is just to be with that instrument and receive the contractual cash flows over its lifetime. Contractual cash flows over its lifetime. Then that is one model, one other model. Then there can be models in between. The business model can be okay. Say you have a commitment to come in 5 years' time. You want to put up a building, head office building, and you are saving some money. You are saving some money to bring as a capital for that building construction over a period of time. So as and when you have some excess money, you go and invest in instrument, but there are some instruments which are 8 years old. But you are not going to keep that money for 8 years because you want to put that money, utilize that money in 5 years' time for the building construction. So you are receiving contractual cash flows until the 5-year time period comes. And then as it comes to the 5-year period, now you take that money out from those instruments and utilize it for the construction of the building. So then you have got a mixed idea, mixed thinking. So what you need to look at is, are you planning to set yourself for the lifetime of the investment or for a long term of the investment and receiving contractual cash flows, or are you planning to just put it now and then take it later and then kind of frequent trading, a type of thing what you are envisaging? That is what you have to look at under business model. What type of a thinking you have got. Actually, I just recall something we studied long time ago as it comes to investments. This is long time ago. SLAS number 22 is the famous standard called investments. And we used to learn there at that time. Investments are categorized as long-term investments and short-term investments. Long-term investments are like permanent nature of investments. You invest in a share and then you stay for a long time. You are not bothered to quickly turn it around and make capital gain and things like that. You are not into trading. As opposed to the current investment means they are trading portfolios, the trading investments. So they used to say those days, I remember, the trading portfolio, the current investment should be put on at market value, mark to market. But long-term investments, you put it at cost and keep it on with it. And as you sell, you realize the capital gain. And this is a very old, very outdated standard. But the thinking was getting developed over a couple of decades. Now where we have come to about? Now we have come to about to discuss what is the basis on which we categorize these investments. Now if I were to recall something from LKS number 39, these things were discussed in LKS number 39 until SLFRS 9 took its position. What LKS number 39 said, or how LKS number 39 classified those investments. They classified as loans and receivables, held to maturity investments, and financial assets at fair value through P&L, and available for sale investments. This is not too far ago, but 2 years ago you would have learnt it. Even could be 1 year ago also you would have harped on this. Now see the names. I'm not criticizing, I'm not condemning. Okay, we were living in certain eras, certain times. Okay, some are now, when you happen to look at it, it looks like very primitive. But now see, they are assigning names. Held to maturity investment. If you are holding until the maturity, they are called held to maturity investment. But what the accounting method was applied to it was amortized cost method. Then available for sale. There was a name. Now there's nothing as such. There's nothing as such. They are not talking about a name. Loans and receivables. There's no financial asset called loans and receivables. There's no financial assets called held to maturity investments. Now you have to look at business model and the cash flow characteristics of the instrument. How the cash flows are going to be generated from the financial asset. Look at the cash flow generation pattern, look at your business model and find out where you should be in. That kind of an exercise was not there in LKS 39. That's why SLFRS 39 is a refined version of LKS 39. So now they say that look at your business, what is your thinking? Now even held to maturity investment, this subject was discussed and we asked the CEO, Mr. So and so, are you planning to keep this investment until its maturity? Now they are not asking that way. What is your business thinking? Are you going to remain with this investment in order to collect contractual cash flows until its maturity, until the end of a certain period? If you say yes, then you are fitting into amortized cost model. Not only that, you need to look at the the cash flow characteristics. That is also important. Look at how cash flows are to be generated from the financial asset. To our knowledge, you see, it can come in a form like, okay, if you are investing in a bond, how the cash flows are going to come? Monthly or quarterly or semi-annually or annually, they will pay interest. That's called coupon payment. So you will be collecting the coupon payment. Always the coupon payment will be paid on the balance outstanding. If they are redeeming the capital also little by little, always the regular payment also will be connected to the outstanding capital balance. And finally, they repay the outstanding capital balance also, the principal. They call it more precisely, whether the contractual terms of the financial asset give rise on specified dates to cash flows that are solely payments of principal and interest on the principal outstanding. If the cash flows are to be payment of principal and the payment of interest on the outstanding principal, then that is one pattern of cash flows that can be expected from the instrument. Then if you connect the two, I invest in a bond is paying regularly interest and the principal, then I am going to be there till the end of the redemption of the instrument. Then the most appropriate method or most appropriate category that I can choose out of the three is amortized cost. Then if you take the business model where like you want to do a frequent trading, along with the cash flow characteristics is something not you expect, not that you are getting principal on selected dates and the interest on the outstanding principal on selected dates. It's not that type of cash flow. For example, now say you are investing in ordinary share of a company. Can you expect every month a dividend to be paid as a fixed payment? No. Can you expect the capital to be repaid to you regularly? No. You are investing in shares. You may get dividend on and off. Some years you get more, some years you don't get, some years you get less. And principal returning is not there unless you decide to sell and then encash your investment. So that has a different characteristic of a cash flow. Cash flow characteristics different. It's not confirmed, it's not guaranteed, it's not regular, very irregular. That can be expected, that should be expected from investment in equity instruments, because they are not to give any fixed cash flows on a regular basis. So if you are talking about irregular cash flow, which is coming out of an equity instrument, typically, you cannot think about amortized model at all. Financial at amortized cost can never be applied on ordinary share investment. For the mere reason, the cash flow pattern does not support it. That's why. So, if your cash flow pattern is something like relating to typically an equity instrument, you have to think about anything between financial asset at fair value through P&L or through OCI. Now here again, you see the beauty. If you are talking about long-termish thinking, holding it for a longer period and realizing this investment after a longer period, then fair value through OCI is a better option than fair value through P&L. You know why? The difference in the accounting treatment is that fair value through P&L means fair value increase and decrease are always adjusted through profit or loss. As if like that fair value increase or decrease has got realized. Whereas if you go to the OCI, the increase and decrease is adjusted through the reserve other comprehensive income reserve. So that whether it should go to P&L or reserve is being decided upon what nature of that or what business model that you are thinking about. Are you for a long haul or are you for a short-term gain? If you are readily, if you are always thinking of selling it at a quick time and making a profit, then fair value through P&L would be a better option. So we discussed this business model and the cash flow characteristics as to find out where the investment or the financial asset should fit in within these three categories. So having said that, I stop this video at this point, but this is not the end of LKS. It is not the end of SLFRS 9. We have some more to go. In video number 3, we will complete the rest of SLFRS 9. Thank you.